Hello, welcome everyone to Astrologer Climate Witness today. What I'm covering today is something that some people may consider a bit rogue, but maybe that's brought about by my own chart where Jupiter, Mars, Uranus are all in the process or have just opposed my Sun, 29 degrees Scorpio. So, yeah. I am doing something quite different here. With the political environment, atmosphere, the climate, and overshoot ecological breakdown that we're having, everything is changing. Nothing is the same. You know, the planet Uranus brings about complete and utter flipping of everything, right? So, what I'm proposing here today has to do with, should we really be using the US Sibley chart anymore? Don't we have a completely different government after the Supreme Court's decision on presidential immunity? Doesn't that completely change the basis of our country, our government, of balance of power between the branches? That really changes everything, doesn't it? So doesn't that mean we have a different government? So my thing is, and now I'm not sure if the time that I used for this really is uh, workable or valid, but I went with the time of day that the Supreme Court uh, pro, uh, announces their decisions. And though that's on Mondays and Thursdays at 10 o'clock. So I went with that Monday, July 1st, when they announced their decision on presidential immunity. Now, there could be a different time for this. Now, I'm not saying that this particular chart would actually be the new chart for the United States. I'm putting this out here for us all to discuss, and it's going to be a process. It could be that this is an interim chart or just chart of that decision. Okay, but I am bringing up the probability that we need a new chart for the United States. I love the Sibley chart. I've always used that chart for the United States. I think that works the best. But considering the changes, the upheaval that we're experiencing, I do believe that if not this chart, possibly, depending on who wins in November, if the Trump side wins and all of his power mechanisms grab power, it may be that we'll be able to establish a possible new chart either on election day or on January 20th or whenever they might decide to take over. I mean, I am not for this. And if you feel in watching this that you think this is a mundane astrology site, I don't talk a lot about personal astrology. So I'm covering mundane astrology, and in that you're going to discuss the governments and the politicians and situations that affect everyone. So the chart that I came up with is, it has 0 degrees Virgo rising. Okay, so, and I looked up a Sabian symbol. I use, let me see here. I use James Burgess, Sabian Mysteries site. And this is the description of the symbolism of 0 to 1 degree of Virgo. A man's head. Seriously, that is what the symbolism begins with for 0 degrees Virgo. Okay, a man's head. The universal idea is best expressed through planets in Virgo, 0 to 1 of Virgo. Oh, I said that. Learning what is significant. The way in which we are unique can best be understood by grasping the significance of exactly where we are and why, learning what is significant in our lives. In the process of personal evolution, it is true that we must begin by making a claim upon life according to how we feel to be different from others. Well, we're all about differences on that side, correct? Not in a good way. It's more divisiveness. Yet it is no less true to give to that uniqueness the perspective of context, by being able to see where we fit in the larger picture and grasping comprehension of the overarching form that characterizes this present moment. We need to learn how to serve the greater purposes of our species by identifying what is and what is not appropriate. How's that going? Dane Rudyard writes, in a portrait, the significant features of a man's head are artistically emphasized. How many times have we seen a profile of Trump's head and then he gets shot? It didn't hit his head, but the shooter was hit in the head. Okay? And remember the Mars Uranus conjunction to Algol and the myth of Medusa and all of this happening now at that transit time? No one will ever be able to affirm our highest worth but ourselves. To express the fullness of character certainly requires an effectiveness, self-assurance to be central and ever present, yet self-betrayal is inevitable should this lead to over self-estimation, and through vanity. We see that all the time, right? In this situation. There are rewards, a multitude of toys and compliments made available to those who learn to apply themselves to the exacting demands of a path of self-proclamation. Self-proclamation. Somebody's doing that all the time. These trinkets of fame and fortune are as ephemeral and inconsequential as the gifts in a Christmas cracker, yet pleasing and helpful to focus the mind. However, the real juice is the prestige that is well-deserved and hard-won, if you're doing this positively, such as a wreath of laurel leaves placed on the head, which endows a person of distinction with legitimate honor. So all of this to me is twisted by this person and the people in that cult. We see in the head a man, the full maturity of his being. We can read there much of his history and aspirations, loves and fears, and the extent of his alignment with his own sense of personal integrity. Doesn't have any. This is what's supposed to be. And what's really interesting, if you remember his chart, he's 28, 29 degrees Leo rising. And the Virgo does not get to be expressed. Okay? It doesn't. Not in a positive way. Life's struggles and openings allow us and cause us to make known and clear those things which we hold to have special importance and give meaning to our lives. Our ideals are brought to bear upon our situations as we pursue our goals. In this way, our great dignity can accrue to ambition. As a fairly advanced level of personal achievement, we find that others have come to depend upon us as a direct result of our having willingly taken on certain responsibilities. Virgo. This is made possible by our confidence in our self-determined set of values that add up to the code and path. In some mysterious ways, this formula engenders a supreme clarity of vision that cuts through the fog of what may be to create a path of what must be. Opportunities to shine, emerge, and attract us so that we continuously accelerate towards greater and greater self-realization. So as you can see, there's positives about this, that if you're paying attention to the symbolism here, but the positives aren't really coming through. But the chart must be reaching for that by the 0 degrees Virgo rising. Okay. Now, the other aspect of that is, I don't know if this is going to come through. No, it's not going to work. Anyways, I'll tell you. So it has the 10th house is 25 degrees Taurus. Ta-da! Where's Uranus? Conjunct 25 degrees Taurus. Okay? Mars is at 16 degrees Taurus. So what we're seeing here, to me, that Uranus conjunct the MC, the public image, the reputation, it's with Uranus there, it's flipping everything on its head. Okay. So if anybody wanted to look this up, like I said, I used 10 o'clock DC time, okay, 10 a.m. in Washington, D.C., because that's where they made the decision. So you can put that in and see July 1st, okay, see what you come up with and see what you think about that chart. Now, again, it may not be the chart of our new nation that I think is coming or is already here, since the massive changes in the balance of power between the branches of government has already taken place. So, now, another thing, just a little quip. I like to use Howard Zinn's People's History of the United States. Yes, I lost the cover. Here he goes. He makes this little discussion here. More and more, the left seemed hell-bent on reclaiming the religious high ground. This effort commenced before the installation of George W. Bush, but the effort spiked somewhat after his re-election. How do you view this trend? It's an interview, and someone's asking him this. I think it's a good thing for the right-wing capture of the Bible to be challenged, and for people who are progressive and religious, like Jim Wallace, like Harvey Cox, like Daniel Berrigan, to point out statements in the Bible that support the idea of peace and equality and serving the poor rather than the rich. Theological doctrines and the Bibles are susceptible to all sorts of interpretations. And, therefore, it is wrong to allow one political party to monopolize the interpretations of the Bible, and it is right to offer a challenge that will cause Christians to think about whether Jesus would approve of war, would approve of siphoning off the wealth of the country for the rich. Okay. Now, okay. I am now going to read an article from Truthout. It's an interview with Noam Chomsky. You can look him up if you don't know who he is. Now, this interview took place in 2019. Okay. So it is there's a lot in there that's very relevant, but you'll see. Okay. Noam Chomsky. To make the U.S. a democracy, the Constitution itself must change. Now, that's a little different take on what I was getting at, but I'd rather hear that from him than the other side. So just take a listen, okay? The Constitution was framed to thwart the democratic aspirations of most of the public, says Chomsky. Trust me, he doesn't mean what they mean. Okay. Honest paywall. Oops, there we go. Why do so many people in the U.S. today find Trump's racist rants and authoritarian mindset appealing? What are the political checks and balances, or lack thereof, that can ward off the impact of the Republican leadership's disastrous policies? Is a constitutional crisis on its way? And how do we face the consequences of an administration that is essentially competing for the title of most dangerous organization in human history? In this exclusive Truthout interview, Emeritus Professor of Linguistics at MIT and laureate professor of linguistics at the University of Arizona, Noam Chomsky, who is widely regarded as one of the greatest thinkers of all time, ranking among the top 10 cited sources of all time, along with Plato, Aristotle, Shakespeare, Hegel, and Freud, dissects Trump's racist attacks, Trumpism, and the current condition of the country in the second decade of the 21st century. C.J. Polychroniou, I think that's how you say his name. So he's asking the questions. According to popular conception, the United States is a nation of immigrants. Although this formulation significantly excludes native people who are already here and were subjected to colonization, displacement, and genocide at the hands of European immigrants, and also excludes African Americans whose ancestors were kidnapped and enslaved. When it is described as a nation of immigrants, the U.S. is often portrayed as a varied nation where people have the freedom to pursue their dreams of a better life while maintaining their own cultural, ethnic, and religious distinctiveness or uniqueness. That's the way I learned when I was very, very young. I understood that when I was 8 or 9 or 10 years old. I remember thinking in those terms. Yet, the truth of the matter is that inequality and oppression of the other have been ongoing political and social realities since the origins of the Republic. In fact, today we have a president in the White House who makes no bones about wishing to see non-white people, even elected representatives of the U.S. Congress, leave the country because they challenge the status quo and seek a United States with a more humane and democratic polity. Meanwhile, the very rich are enjoying political privileges like never before. Noam, what are some of the tangible and intangible factors that seem to be pushing the country socially, politically, and economically backward rather than forward? Noam Chomsky. I guess it's a little bit dark, right? I don't know. So, okay. Noam Chomsky. Trump's diatribes successfully inflame his audience, many of whom apparently feel deeply threatened by diversity, cultural change, or simply the recognition that the white Christian nation of their collective imagination is changing before their eyes. White supremacy is nothing new in the United States. The late George Frederickson Comparative Studies of White Supremacy found the U.S. to be almost off the charts, more extreme even than the apartheid of South Africa. As late as the 1960s, the U.S. had anti-miscegenation laws so extreme that the Nazis refused to adopt them as a model for their racist Nuremberg laws. That's wild. And the power of the Southern Democrats was so great that until the 60s, activism shattered the framework of legal racism, if not its practice by other means. Even New Deal federal housing programs enforced segregation, barring black people from new housing programs. It goes back to the country's origins. While progressive in many ways by the standards of the day, the U.S. was founded on two brutal racist principles: the most hideous systems of slavery in human history, the most hideous system of slavery in human history, because they're always coming up on the other side with, well, we've always had slavery, right? Completely different. The source of much of its wealth, England's too. The slavery was the source of the U.S. wealth and England's wealth too. And the need to rid the national territory of Native Americans, whom the Declaration of Independence explicitly described as merciless Indian savages, and whom the framers saw as barring the expansion of the superior race. Immigrants were supposed to be white immigrants. In fact, basically Anglo-Saxon, in accord with weird racist myths of the founding fathers that persisted through the 19th century. That includes the leading Enlightenment figures. Benjamin Franklin urged that Germans and Swedes be barred because they were too swarthy. Thomas Jefferson was greatly interested in Anglo-Saxon language and law, part of his immersion in the Saxon myth that English democracy and law traced back to pre-Norman Saxon period. The first Naturalization Act, 1790, restricted that option to whites and then extended it to the ex-slaves after the Civil War. The country, of course, needed immigrants to settle the Indian country, from which indigenous nations were expelled or exterminated, as the founders put it. But they were supposed to be white, a somewhat flexible cultural constructed category. By the late 19th century, Asians were excluded by law. The first more general immigration law was the 1924, designed to bar Jews and Italians primarily. There's no need to review here the horrendous record of how Jews were prevented from fleeing Nazi barbarism crimes that persisted even after the war. Truman sent Earl Harrison on a mission to inspect the concentration camps where Jews were still held under grotesque conditions, as he reported. About the only effect was to intensify efforts to ship them to Palestine. Yeah. The 1924 law remained in place until 1965. By the 1980s, immigration began to be criminalized. Treatment of Haitians fleeing terror was particularly despicable. Guantanamo was first used as a detention center by the Bush 1 administration and Clinton administration, a place to get rid of black people fleeing in terror from the murderous coup regime that the U.S. leaders were supporting, despite pretenses to the contrary. They were classified as economic migrants, a cynical pretense and gross violation of international law and minimal decency, because it should have been asylum seeker, but not economic migrants. Okay. Remember, it said the U.S. was supporting those coups in African countries. That's another whole thing. Another ugly story. It's not terribly surprising then to read a report of a conference of conservative intellectuals where one esteemed speaker, University of Pennsylvania law professor Amy Wax, explained learnedly that our country will be better off with more whites and fewer non-whites, since immigrants may not quickly come to think, live, and act just like us, because the social and cultural climate of their places of origin. Wax failed to elaborate on whether her parents, Jewish immigrants from Eastern Europe, came from a cultural and social climate where people were thinking and acting like us. Figure. It's not hard to understand why these deep currents are becoming more manifest and ominous today, after 40 years of savage capitalism unleashed by the neoliberal assault. It's enough to recall that for a large majority of the workforce, wages have either stagnated or declined since 1979, when the neoliberal assault was just taking off. From the country's origins, U.S. workers benefited from the world's highest wages. Since the 1980s, though, the unusual advantages persisted. Working people have fallen behind the rest of the developed world by many measures, healthcare for one. For a review of their current status, see Amanda Novella and Jeff Madrick's February 2019 contribution to the journal Challenge. The effects of the assault are sharp concentration of wealth and power, increasingly in large predatory financial institutions, stagnation or decline for the majority, deterioration of benefits, astonishing collapse of infrastructure, a form of globalization designed to pit working people against one another for the benefit of international investors, weakening of institutions to protect workers' rights, undermining a functioning democracy, and much else that is all too familiar. The result in the US and Europe is an upsurge of anger, resentment, and all too often a search for scapegoats, typically those even more disadvantaged who are portrayed as being coddled by liberal elites. It's a dangerous mix, fertile territory for demagogues. The threats are far more extreme than the incipient fascist-style tendencies, which are severe enough. It cannot be overlooked that humans are facing a decision of extraordinary significance, which must be made very soon. Will organized human society survive in anything like its present form, or will it be devastated by global catastrophe? The two most ominous threats are nuclear war and environmental catastrophe, both increasing. On the latter, major energy corporations are apparently planning on a future with 5 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels by mid-century, and with that in mind, are racing to accelerate what climate scientists recognize to be indescribable catastrophe by maximizing the profitable production of fossil fuels, joined by the biggest banks and other major capitalist institutions. Meanwhile, the Republican administration, determined to safeguard its credentials as the most dangerous organization in human history, is anticipating a slightly less overwhelming catastrophe, a rise of 4C by the end of the century, also far above what scientists recognize to be a colossal danger. And it concludes from this detailed environmental assessment that we should not limit automotive emissions because what's the difference? We're going over the cliff anyway. If there is anything like this in the world history, I haven't found it, and this passes with scarcely a raised eyebrow. Of course, this is only science, and as right-wing radio host Rush Limbaugh instructs his tens of millions of radio listeners, science is one of the four corners of deceit, along with government, academia, and media of the wrong sort. All of this tells us that the tasks ahead are urgent on many fronts. Another common misperception is that American culture and society adapt easily to change. Yet, this is a country where it is immensely difficult to change even outdated and dysfunctional political processes and institutions, such as the Electoral College and the distribution of Senate seats. It is very hard to pass amendments to the Constitution, and so far we have faced many barriers to moving away from the two-party system. How do we explain the inflexibility of U.S. political processes and institutions? In the 19th century, the U.S. Constitution was in many ways a progressive document, even though it was a framers' coup. Against the democratic aspirations of most of the public, the title of Michael Klarman's impressive study of the making of the Constitution, generally regarded as the gold standard in the scholarly literature. The document has inherent problems, which are leading to a likely constitutional crisis. The problems are serious enough for the law professor Aaron Chemerinsky, writing on America's constitutional crisis, to entitled his article, The First Priority, Making America a Democracy, in parentheses, contrary to the intentions of the framer. He reviews some of the familiar problems. One has to do with the Electoral College, which was designed by the framers because of their distrust of popular government. By now, states with 23% of the population have enough electoral votes to choose the president. Even more importantly, the same radical imbalance makes the Senate a highly undemocratic institution, in accord with the intentions of the framers. In Madison's constitutional design, the Senate was the most powerful branch of government and the most protected from public interference. It was to represent the wealth of the nation, the most responsible men who have sympathy for property and its rights. Furthermore, though the framers did not anticipate this, of course, social and demographic changes have placed this excessive anti-democratic power in the hands of a part of the population that is mostly rural, white, Christian, socially conservative, and traditionalist, generally sympathetic to the wax principle. Some of these undemocratic features were virtually unavoidable. The Constitution would never have been ratified if the smaller colonies were not granted an equal voice, but by now the effects are severe and unchangeable by amendment because of the same radical imbalance in voting power. These problems are exacerbated by the monopolization of politics by the two political parties and the winner-take-all state laws that bar proportional representation, which can permit a variety of voices to enter the political arena, sometimes growing to major parties. Some have argued, not implausibly, that if a country with the U.S. system tried to join the European Union, the application might be rejected by the European Court of Justice. The impending crisis is becoming more severe because of the malevolence of the Republican leadership. They are well aware that their formula of abject service to wealth and corporate power, along with mobilization of voting base of the kind that shows up at Trump rallies, is not enough to overcome their growing minority status. The solution is radical gerrymandering of the kind now authorized by the reactionary Roberts Court and stacking the judiciary with far-right justices who will be able to hold the country by the throat for many years. Here, the evil genius is Mitch McConnell, who maneuvered to block appointments under Obama, a campaign of obstruction that left 106 vacancies at the end of Obama's second term, including the scandalous case of Merrick Garland, and is now rushing through appointment of Federalist Society choices. Another recurring theme of U.S. history involves religious fundamentalism, which is still widespread through the country. Does the United States, in some ways, look more like a fundamentalist nation rather than an advanced secular republic? Throughout its history, the U.S. has been an unusually fundamentalist society, with regular great awakenings and beliefs that as far as a far-off spectrum of developed societies. Almost 80% of Americans believe in miracles. There is a huge evangelical community, a large part of the Trump base, which he keeps in line by throwing them crumbs. Secretary of State like Pompeo, a devout evangelical Christian, speculated recently that God might have sent Trump to save Israel from Iran, which is threatening Israel with destruction in the fantasy world of doctrinal verities. Fully 40% of Americans expect Jesus to return to Earth by mid-century, 23% certainly. It's possible that this accounts for some of the looking away that we were discussing earlier. All in all, it is a curious form of exceptionalism that goes back to the earliest settlers. The United States remains a global superpower, but its domestic society is strikingly unequal and poverty is rampant. Given that, should we interpret Trumpism as a political phenomenon akin to the same dynamics that gave rise in the pre-war era to fascism and other forms of authoritarian rule in Europe and elsewhere? Already in the 1950s, economist John Kenneth Galbraith described U.S. society as marked by private affluence, public squalor. It's true that the public sphere often resembles a third world country. The infrastructure report card of the American Society of Civil Engineers regularly ranks the U.S. down at the bottom, D+. And one can hardly walk through the U.S. cities or travel in poor rural areas without being shocked at the squalor. The same holds for social justice measures. Among OECD countries, the U.S. ranks near the bottom. I don't think this relates specifically to Trumpism, except insofar as the contemporary Republican leadership is a virtual caricature of long-standing features of U.S. political economy based on business power that is unusual by historical standards, with a pervasive impact on the political system and also on the hegemonic common sense in Gramscian terms. The business classes are not just unusually powerful, but are also highly class conscious, constantly engaged in bitter class war, in some ways vulgar Marxists with values inverted. There is variation. The New Deal period brought the U.S. somewhat closer to European-style social democracy, but from the 80s, that has been sharply reversed. By now, when Bernie Sanders calls for renewing and extending the New Deal, ideas that would not have greatly surprised Eisenhower, he is considered a radical who wants to destroy American values. Trumpism and pre-war fascism seem to be a different matter. There surely are resemblances. Just speaking personally, Trump's Greenville, North Carolina rally evoked my childhood memories of listening to the radio to Hitler's Nuremberg rallies, not understanding the words, but the mood was apparent enough and frightening. The not-so-subtle appeals to racism, xenophobia, misogyny, the treachery of dissent, demonization of media that do not kowtow abjectly to the grand leader, all this and more is reminiscent of pre-war fascism, and the social base of Trumpism has similarities to pre-war fascism as well. Super rich power and petty bourgeois popular base. But pre-war fascism was based on control of all aspects of society, business included, by a powerful state in the hands of totalitarian, all-powerful ruling party, Gleichschaltung. Something like that. The situation here is quite different, almost the opposite. With the increasingly monopolized business world, particularly in financial sector, having overwhelming power in social, political life, and doctrinal management. In the 1980s, Japan was regarded as the most likely power to replace U.S. hegemony. We know what happened to that forecast. Now many pundits see China as a future global superpower. Is this a realistic assessment of future geopolitical developments given the huge economic and military gap that exists today between China and the United States? The Japan is number one fantasy traces in large part to the incompetence of U.S. management, which was unable to compete with superior Japanese production methods. Reagan took care of that with voluntary export restraints, where voluntary means do it or else, making clear who is number one, and number of other devices, One was SDI, Star Wars, sold to the public and maybe to Reagan himself as defense against the evil enemy, but to the corporate world as a great business opportunity, courtesy of the taxpayer, a familiar benefactor. As for China, it has made substantial economic and technological progress, but remains a very poor country. It is ranked 86th in the 2018 update to the UN Developmental Index, right below Algeria. Now that may change because that's like, what, 6 years? They might have moved up a bit, especially because of what's coming next. But India is ranked 130th, barely above East Timor. China has huge international problems unknown in the West. It is argued that China is comparable to the US, maybe ahead in purchasing power parity, but that means that it is far below per capita, per person. China has been pursuing systemic plans to expand its influence through Eurasia in somewhat uneasy partnership with an economically much weaker Russia, first through Shanghai Cooperation Council, now with the Belt and Road Initiative. Okay. In some areas of technology, solar panels, electric cars, it may be in the lead, but it still has a long way to go to reach the level of rich industrial societies. The US is concerned with Chinese growth and is seeking, pretty openly, to impede it, not a very attractive policy stance. It's also worth bearing in mind that in the age of neoliberal globalization, national accounts are a less meaningful measure of economic power than in the past. Political economist Sean Stars has done informative work on a different measure: proportion of world wealth held by domestically based multinational corporations. Like I said, I'm going to do one on David Corton's book, When Corporations Rule the World. I'm doing that one coming up. By that measure, the US is far in the lead internationally, owning a spectacular 50% of world wealth, more than the US share of global GDP at the peak of its power in 1945. The US corporations are in the lead in just about every category. China is sure to have a major role in world affairs. A sane policy would be accommodation and cooperation, which doesn't seem out of the range of possibility. And that is it. Okay? Now, we all, most of the people, don't know a whole lot about foreign policy necessarily. But I've read a little bit of Noam Chomsky now for years, and I've listened to him on Democracy Now! Over the years, and he's pretty intelligent and really kind of knows what's going on. And being a linguist, that's the thing. He understands what's underneath all the talk. Okay, to me, that's a big deal. So, again, I'm just going to bring up the probability that we may need a new chart for the United States. We shall see. I mean, that chart, even if it's just used as an event chart for the Supreme Court decision, it's very significant if you ask me. So, okay. What else? I'm not sure I can really cover much else right now. We don't know what's coming next, people. I mean, it's really like taking the deck of cards and throwing them in the air. At least that's what it seems to us. The other side, the right, the Republicans, the new Republicans. I don't even know if that's what they're going to call themselves anymore. They may know because they may have a plan. Who knows? I mean, now see, another thing about the whole head myth, and for all of you people who don't know astrology, we're not saying that it's just reflective. It's symbolism. How it's symbolized, why the synchronicity is there, who knows? I don't have an answer for that. But it really works if you really pay attention. And if you're not going to study astrology, then don't pay attention. If you don't want to listen to astrological determination or discussions, then don't come here. Okay. But for those of you who love studying mundane astrology, I hope that you appreciate this. I'm trying to get better at doing this. I've been a little shy. I always think, I'm not doing the right things, not meshing things together enough. The correlations, but I'm working on it. Okay. Anyways, I guess I should go. I was ready and raring to go because I did my bike ride today. Not that far. I did 9 miles today. Yeah, tonight I'm gonna work in my garden again. Um, it's going pretty good this year. We managed to put the papers down to keep the weeds down. And again, you know, the best thing the best advice I could say if you're feeling frustrated and like you don't know what to do, because I feel like that almost all the time. If you live in a rural area, I'm going to start with that. Get your hand pump well, if you have your own well, put it in. I haven't done it yet, but I'm getting there. We always have to put money out for something else. They're not that expensive. It's putting it in, I think that's the expense. Get yourself fire bricks if you're going to make a cooking pit outside. I know a lot of people have grills, but where are you going to get the gas eventually someday? Or my point is, some of this stuff will still be around. Electricity will be around for a while maybe, and gas, but it's going to get more expensive. Like watering my garden, that ramps up my electric a bit, right? So if I have a hand pump well, I can hook the hose, I'm thinking, and I can hand pump the water down to buckets. Yeah, I do all that. I mean, I use the well now, and I don't have to use the buckets. Although last night my husband ran over the hose with the lawnmower, so now, yeah, we have to get another piece for the end because he cut the end off. Those little mundane, everyday happenings, in the real world with real people. But the outdoor fire pit and making an oven if you really want somehow. I saw videos online on how to make a outdoor oven, and they're kind of involved and they kind of cost a lot. But there's ways to do it maybe that might not cost all that much. But it's a way to live if things get expensive and it saves you a little money. You're not using. I have a gas stove and I can cut back on the gas. I don't have to spend money on the gas. I have my wood stove. Also for winter time. I've said all these things before, but divorce yourself as much as possible from the infrastructure of global civilization, industrial civilization, so that you're ready and you're prepared when problems happen. Yeah, we broke down and bought a generator. My husband wanted to get it, so we got one. But it's not something that, might always be workable down the road. So I'm lucky, I know, because I live out here. But my house was not expensive at all. We were lucky we got in right before the prime crash in 2008. We bought our house pretty low. We don't live in an expensive area. So yeah, I wouldn't change it for anything. And if you live in the cities or suburbs you might be able to work out some things. But if you live in the cities, from all my readings, I'm sorry, but as much as people love city life, it's not sustainable. I think I've discussed that in some ways. I should look up some things on why cities are not sustainable. I know that's going to raise a lot of questions and resistance from people because they love living in the city. My younger daughter loves living in the city. It's that camaraderie, I think a lot of it, and I don't blame them. I mean, I lived down there for a long time. One of my favorite things was when I was like 20, 21, something like that, about 20. My boyfriend and I were living with his friends for a short time while we were trying to get our apartment. And we were taken to a get together at somebody's house. I don't even know what town down in Long Island it was. It was in Long Island. And he lived in Queens. But there was all these people outside cooking, and they were doing yoga, and people were studying astrology, and it was just so fantastic. It was a summer party, and there was fires outside and people playing guitar. I mean, it was just fantastic. So I get that whole let's get together kind of thing. I know that can seem a little kumbaya, at this point. But hey, if you can find people that you can be with and have times like that, it means a lot, it's really nice. So, anyways, take care. Hope to see you back. Alrighty. Thank you for visiting Astrologer Climate Witness today.